While we are holding our program, there are hostilities ongoing in Iraq. People really always think about happiness, they strive for it. But in fact, we see that evil on earth is increasing, penetrating into all spheres of society. Lawlessness and violence are growing. How can these paradoxes be explained? Aren't you embarrassed by the fact that we are holding our conversation about happiness while such things are ongoing?
I believe that it's precisely such crisis situations that make us again and again rethink, change the views on the predestination of man on earth. Man is really born to be happy. All evil, all adversity happening with humanity is conditioned by its nraviousness. Everything in the world is done in the best way for us, as much as possible given the prevailing objective nraviousness in society, given those worldview delusions that are characteristic of humanity. Take, for example, those events in Iraq. After all, a global, inhuman, bloody performance is being staged there, in which both Bush and Hussein irreproachably play the roles assigned to them, acting as mindless puppets. Bush, not discerning the global scenario, fell into it, as happened at one time with our puppet State Committee on the state of emergency. Note that this time the notification of the initiated periphery about the presence of a global scenario went through the Swan Lake Ballet, which, as in the times of the State Emergency Committee, played on the TV channel Culture for 3 hours on March the 17th, 2003. The final goal of the directors and scriptwriters, who have complete control over such figures as Bush, Milosevic, Bin Laden, Hussein, is to put together, with the help of these agents, 2 sufficiently wide blocks to get geschäft on the global destabilization of the world situation. In the newspaper Arguments and Facts, number 12, 1961 is called the year of recruitment of Hussein by the CIA services, which, as we noted earlier, are not under the control of the US statehood, but are enclosed structurelessly on the supranational level of governance. For us, it is not so important whether Hussein is recruited for this operation directly or bypassing his consciousness, but it is with his help that a bloc of the second warring side is formed. So, with a sufficient measure of understanding, we must distance ourselves both from the conflict itself and from any bloc formed by the supranational level. In my opinion, our president, at this stage, is managing to pursue this sole correct line. Avoiding a nationwide disaster is one of the variants for finding happiness.
In the history of our people, happiness is one way or another connected with the spirituality of a person, a family. In turn, spirituality is an area with which religion primarily deals. What do you think of such interconnections? And how can one leave the field of evil, which is the antipode of happiness?
In my opinion, you have correctly noted the interconnections. Happiness really accompanies more that one who has comprehended religion as a connection between man and God, but directly, without intermediaries. Look into a person's face. If his face is stamped with a sincere smile and dobriousness, it means that he is in harmony with God. Not a single fact annoys him or makes him mad, as he understands that the events taking place are marked by the will of God, and their side effects, and sometimes catastrophicness, are conditioned, as we have already noted, by the low measure of nraviousness of the participants in these events. If instead of turning to God, people go to the church, then it is difficult to expect both dobro and true happiness. Only in the field of Christianity, there are up to 4,000 different kinds of sects and branches, asserting their own exclusivity and dividing people into warring groups. How is it possible that in such an atmosphere of vulgar atheism, one can find a connection with the one God for all people, and the resulting happiness and dobrous mood? So the catastrophicness of the life of many in our country is connected, among other things, with the rejection of God in favor of the earthly church hierarchs, groundlessly claiming the role of intermediaries in the relationship between man and God. What happens in churches? In words there, you are told the commandments of dobriousness and dobronraviousness, and what is offered to you in the church by default, in images. And in images, wherever you cast your gaze, you will see Jesus Christ crucified, tormented on the cross. Pictures, images, leave a much deeper mark on a person than words. But in any case, an inversion is introduced into the brain. In words, dobro, and in images, evil and torment. For those versed in magic, in occult methods, it is obvious that in the churches there is a programming of the psyche of the flock for the catastrophicness of life. For regular visitors, this also manifests itself at the physiological level, not only at the field, bioenergetic level. The bleeding wounds of Christ periodically appear on the bodies of believers. This phenomenon is called the mystery of the stigmata. Science attributes this phenomenon to the consequences of the psychological impact of the crucifixion scene. The Bible scares believers at least 300 times with the horrors of hell, and also programs their psyche for the catastrophicness of life. And who programs the psyche of countless religious fanatics terrorists? Neglecting earthly life under the impact of the church, they gladly destroy themselves and their own kind all over the earth. Without understanding these elementary truths, it is impossible to egress from the field of evil and become truly happy.
Before moving on to the civilizational features of the perception of happiness, could you dwell on some particular issues? Now they talk a lot about the laws of karma, about signs that portend misfortune. Do you have any practical tips from everyday life?
As for the law of karma, there are many delusions in this question. If bloodline genetics is oppressed by some kind of viciousness, then the task of a representative of this bloodline is to comprehend this vice, live it out of his own practice, and thereby get rid of any karmic retribution. If this vice remains the norm in the life of a new generation, then of course there appears a karmic retribution. But in this question there is no programming. A person has free will and forms his own destiny, governing any karmic retributions. A person is never responsible for what he did not do, for God is merciful and previous. This is only a biblical self-concoction, the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 53, that allows the torture of the previous one for the sins of others. However, in the same Bible, in the book Wisdom of Solomon, the exact opposite is stated. It is stated that God cannot punish the innocent for someone's sins. You will not find this truth of Solomon in some Western Bibles, where it was cut out of the text. As for the signs, this is a very delicate question. If a person has a stable psyche and does not believe in them, then signs do not work in relation to him. This is the most right scheme for finding happiness. If a person believes in signs, then in order to gain psychological balance, protective measures should be taken, such as looking into the mirror if you returned home for a forgotten object, or not to be the first one to cross the path of a black cat. The fact is that if a person who believes in signs is the first to cross the street after a black cat, then the algorithm for programming the psyche for an unfavorable event will activate in him, and the taken shape thought form will give its result in real life. Every person must learn to form thought forms of happiness. If a girl dreams, for example, of a good husband, then she gets him, only if she specifies all his qualities. And the more detailedly she envisions her future husband, the faster her dream materializes. This algorithmics works both for a certain family and for the country as a whole. There will be no blagorious changes in the country if the majority of those living in it, dreaming of a better life, want either a new constitution or who knows what. On the contrary, if at least 10 to 15% of our people have formed stable thought forms of how our country should be arranged, then this mental future will materialize the quicker, the fuller we see this matrix of the future in detail. In other words, we must translate our dreams of a better life into some kind of systematized information endowed with a measure. Actually, our program Epiphany, the activities of our social initiative, the conceptual party Unity, are aimed precisely at the formation in all regions of our country of clear ideas on the arrangement of our statehood, which will provide simple human happiness for the majority of the people, schemes for guaranteed, crisis-free development of our life in harmony with others, with nature, the cosmos, and God. After all, happiness with a capital letter is impossible surrounded by unhappy people, dragging out a beggarly existence. Happy is the one who created around himself a kind of space of love and happiness, having included people, the whole environment, and God there. It is impossible in principle to be happy behind the armor of a limousine, behind a 3-meter fence.
At the present time, in my opinion, ideas about happiness in terms of receiving sensual pleasures are being actively cultivated.
Yes, it's true, but there is nothing new about it. This interpretation of happiness, the perception of life through pleasure, is called hedonism. Those who are committed to it have always been the most unfortunate category of humanity, meaninglessly burning their lives, wandering in suffering from one pleasure to another. As is known, the birth of Buddhism is connected with the name Buddha Shakyamuni, so it was he who announced the so-called Four Noble Truths. Life is suffering. The cause of suffering is dissatisfaction with desires. The cessation of suffering is connected with getting rid of desires. To get rid of desires, one needs to gain knowledge about the right life. We will touch upon the flawedness of Buddhism in the search for happiness. For now we note that it gives an accurate interpretation of the inconsistency of hedonism, which reduces life to receiving pleasure and ultimately to endless suffering. So these problems were comprehended by humanity long before our era and expressed by the famous proverb, "If you don't want to be wise, suffer." A person becomes a slave to his desires, and therefore, ultimately, a slave to separate hierarchies, demonic personalities. It is impossible to be happy not only in the coordinates of satisfying particular desires, but also in the coordinates of individual life objectives. The achievement or non-achievement of each of them leads to the need to revise life guidelines every time, to be an endless fuss in the pursuit of happiness, which is not there while you strive for it, and which disappears exactly at the moment of its achievement. Self-perfection of the highest reason proceeds through the human soul, and therefore the meaning of our life should be sought not in the external world, but in ourselves, in the realization of the genetically determined potential of human development. Instead of developing its own abilities, humanity is refined in the development of various kinds of technological prostheses, attachments that artificially expand the ability of the eye, ear, and other sense organs. We still do not understand that it's better to look at the world directly, but not through the constantly improving television screen. At the same time, only the one who has comprehended the immortality of his soul and lives on the basis of ideas about eternal life is truly happy. Truly, dobro-nravya's deeds are committed by those who are free from fuss and are not bound by time in movement towards the clearly comprehended objective of their being, to the development of their own psyche towards true humanness, with a weakening of the orientation towards animal instincts, towards algorithms which are characteristic of zombie biorobots, of people with a demonic type of psyche structure. Every person only himself and directly can find happiness and peace of spirit, having mastered life in the mode of guidance by God. One cannot go to God as a thoughtless crowd and acquire truth and happiness.
Could you dwell on the civilizational features of the algorithms for acquiring happiness?
The culture of our crowd elite civilization, at least for the last 3,000 years, has been divided into an esoteric component intended exclusively for the initiated, as they say, for a narrow circle of people, and an exoteric one, open to everyone. Until recently, by all means, a deaf, impenetrable information armor was strengthened between them. As a result, esotericists, for example of Japan and China, in the name of maintaining crowd elitism, prefer to fill the vacuum at the level of esotericism, planting the financial economic theories of the West in their own peoples, just in order to maintain a monopoly on truth among the initiated. So a feature of any exoteric culture is that people turn not to the spiritual life of the individual and to the soul, but exclusively to the external world, the acquisition, consumption, and transformation of material objects. These tendencies are most clearly and consistently expressed in the biblical esoteric doctrine of buying up the world and enslaving humanity on the basis of a corporate monopoly on the issuance of world money and usury on a global scale. This doctrine made the West an instrument of subjugation and destruction of the population of other regional civilizations of the planet Earth. At the exoteric level, the West carries a veiled idea of the need to escape from real life on Earth. This is realized through the imposition of acceptance and obedience, with the hope of subsequent retribution in paradise instead of a normal life on Earth. Herewith, the mission of saving man from earthly nightmares, organized by exotericists, is redirected by them to God. The esoteric teachings of the Vedic Buddhist East, in essence, differ little from the ones of the West, since they lead to the same result, to a person's departure from the realities of earthly life. The same idea of the need to escape from an uncomfortable earth to some other world, to nirvana, yoga, is imposed on the people. The difference with the West is only that a person must pave the way into this world not through God, but independently, although not without the help of earthly teachers who keep these traditions of departure from life, instead of creating an earthly paradise which was taught by the prophets, including Christ. If someone from the esotericists of the East remains in earthly life or returns to it of his own free will, then this is done in order to teach the escape technique to others, and not in order to change this world, to make it happy for earthly life. Russian people have always differed both from Western and Eastern people. From the point of view of the West, the Russian Ivan the Fool has always been cut off from real life. However, in its Western understanding, in the sense of the absence of the aspirations to acquire wealth, Rus has always revered in its people spirituality, dobriousness, and praviousness, the desire to help one's own neighbor, all of which is incomprehensible to the West. It is in this area that the search for happiness and the meaning of life in Russian civilization is conducted. From the point of view of the Vedic Buddhist East, Rus is mired in earthly affairs, in the transformation of material objects. From the point of view of carriers of the Russian spirit themselves, true happiness can be found only by generating the collective spirituality of society, aimed at arranging our home, planet Earth. Rus, unlike the other civilizations, has never been oriented on escape from real life, believing that man is created for happiness primarily during his earthly life. Our program, the conception of social safety, dead water, serves to detect algorithms for achieving earthly well-being.